There's a moment from October 2023 that is permanently etched into my brain. I was standing about 50 feet away in a sun-drenched plaza in Querétaro, Mexico, watching my 26-year-old wife, Sofia. She was sitting on a wrought iron bench with a man who looked exactly her age. Her head was resting on his shoulder and she was laughing, really laughing, the kind of laugh that sounds like music you haven't heard in years. This is what broke me. They had only met 4 months earlier. I had been married to her for over 2 years, and in all that time, she had never looked that comfortable with me. Not once. My name is Larry. I'm 64 years old, and this is how I lost over $156,000, my dignity, and 2 years of my life. But I want to be very clear, Sofia wasn't a scammer. She didn't empty my bank accounts in the middle of the night. This isn't a crime story. This is a story about what actually happens when a 62-year-old man tries to build a life around a 26-year-old and realizes, far too late, that love doesn't cancel out biology, time, or the reality of two completely different futures. I paid for every dress she wore, her plane tickets, her legal fees, and eventually the very suitcases she used to walk out on me. If you think your situation is different or that age is just a number, you need to listen to this. Let me take you back to how this started. April 2021. I'd been retired for about 8 months. I spent 34 years as a mechanical engineer for a company in Minneapolis. I had a good career, nothing flashy, but I'd done well. I'd saved up about $680,000 in my 401k and IRA. My house was paid off, a nice 3-bedroom rambler in Bloomington worth about $425,000. Between my pension and Social Security, I was bringing in $4,100 a month. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable. Extremely comfortable. My wife Linda had passed away 3 years prior, ovarian cancer. It was brutal watching her fade. We were high school sweethearts together for 32 years. After she was gone, I threw myself into work just to survive the silence. But then retirement hit and suddenly I was trapped in that silence. My daughter Amy lives in Denver. My son Chris is in Seattle. They'd visit for the holidays, but the rest of the year I was just sitting in that big empty house eating frozen dinners and watching Netflix. I wasn't living, I was just waiting for the clock to run out. One night at the Elks Lodge, a buddy of mine mentioned an international dating site. He specifically mentioned looking for women in Mexico. He talked about how family-oriented they were, how traditional they were, and how they actually appreciated older men. I laughed it off. I thought that's for guys who can't cut it here. But a few Saturdays later, sitting in front of a cold plate of pasta, I downloaded the app. The first few days were discouraging. I got hit with a lot of fake profiles, women who looked like models claiming to live in tiny mountain villages I'd never heard of. I was about to delete the whole thing when I saw her profile. Sofia, her photo wasn't staged. She was at a family birthday party wearing a simple green dress, laughing at something off camera. She was 26, from a city called San Juan del Rio, just north of Mexico City. She worked in a dental office. Her bio got me. It didn't talk about traveling or luxury. She talked about her abuela, her love for classic 80s rock, which was my era, and how she believed that loyalty was the most important thing in a relationship. I spent 20 minutes writing a message asking about her favorite Queen's song. I hit send and waited. 1 day, nothing. 2 days, nothing. I felt like an idiot. Then on the 4th day, she replied. She apologized, saying she gets flooded with messages and almost missed mine because I didn't start with "Hey, beautiful." We talked for 3 hours that night. It felt natural. Over the next 3 months, we talked every single day. Video calls, WhatsApp messages, photos of our meals. She was present. She remembered the names of my kids. She'd ask how my back felt. For the first time in years, someone was genuinely interested in me. I told my daughter Amy about her. There was this long, painful silence on the phone when I mentioned Sofia was 26. Amy pointed out that she's 2 years younger than her. She told me to be careful, that she'd heard stories about gringos getting cleaned out in Mexico. I got defensive. I told her Sofia was different, and I believed it. 4 months in, I told Sofia I wanted to visit her. She explained that in her culture, if a young woman dates a much older foreigner, people make terrible assumptions. She said her family was very traditional. If I just showed up, they'd judge her. She suggested I do video calls with her parents first. I spent the next few weeks having these awkward translated conversations with her father, Mateo, and her mother, Elena. Mateo was quiet, sizing me up. He asked about my intentions and my retirement. Through Sofia's translation, he told me he worried about the age gap, that when I was gone, she'd still be young and alone. I told him I'd make sure she was taken care of. Then right at the 6-month mark, something happened. Sofia's brother, Javier, got into a bad accident on his motorcycle. Broken leg, head trauma, hospitalized. She called me in hysterics. She wasn't asking for money, just crying because the hospital bills were climbing and her father was talking about selling his truck, the family's only source of income, to pay for it. I didn't even think. I sent $2,500. A week later, I got a photo of Javier with a thumbs up and a voice note from her mother crying and calling me an angel. That moment right there is when I felt needed. I felt like I mattered to a family that actually cared. I flew to Mexico in November 2021. I booked a suite at a high-end hotel in San Miguel de Allende. I wanted everything to be perfect. When I saw her at the airport, she was even more beautiful in person. Smaller than I expected, but she had this energy that made me feel 40 again. Her father shook my hand with a grip like iron and told me I was part of the family. That week was the best week of my life. We ate at the best restaurants, walked the cobblestone streets, and met dozens of her cousins. On the last night, over a bottle of expensive tequila, I asked her to marry me. She cried and said yes. We got married 3 weeks later in a civil ceremony in San Juan del Rio. I paid for everything: the venue, the food for 70 people, the music. It cost me about $10,000, but I didn't care. My kids didn't come. They said they couldn't get the time off, but I knew they didn't approve. Then began the visa process. Immigration lawyers, filing fees, medical exams. Another $9,000. While we waited for her K-1 visa, I flew back to Minneapolis and started sending her $1,000 a month. I wanted her to quit her job so she could focus on English classes. Then her father's truck needed a new engine. Then her abuela needed heart medication. Every time I sent the money, I felt like a provider. It felt like love. By the time her visa was approved 14 months later, I'd already sent about $50,000 to Mexico. Sofia arrived in Minneapolis in March 2023. I was there with roses and a huge sign. I'd redecorated the house, bought Mexican groceries, even hired a satellite service so she could watch her telenovelas. For the first month, it was great. We went to the Mall of America, we saw the frozen lakes. But then reality set in. I'd go to bed at 9:30 p.m. She'd be wide awake, staring at her phone. I wanted to stay home, she wanted to go out. She didn't have a license, so she was stuck in the house all day while I was doing retired man things like gardening or meeting the guys at the lodge. She started getting depressed. I suggested she join a Spanish-speaking group at the local Catholic church. I thought it would help her make friends her own age. She started going to the church in St. Paul every Sunday. Soon it was Tuesdays for Bible study and Fridays for community dinners. She'd come home glowing. She mentioned a guy named Alejandro, a nurse who had moved from Mexico a few years ago. She said he was helping her understand the system. I tried to be the cool husband. I didn't want to be the jealous old man. But then I saw them at that festival in Querétaro. We had gone back for a visit in September 2023. I had a migraine and told her to go to the festival without me. I felt better a few hours later and decided to surprise her. That's when I saw them on that bench. The way they were talking. It wasn't the way she talked to me. With me, it was always a bit of a struggle, a bit of an explanation. With him, it was effortless. They shared the same slang, the same cultural references, the same time. That night, I confronted her. I asked if she loved him. She didn't say no. She just started crying. She told me she tried to love me, but she felt like she was living in a cage. She said, "Larry, you are a good man, but you are ready to die, and I am just starting to live." She packed her bags 2 weeks later. Alejandro picked her up in his truck. I stood in the driveway of my $425,000 house and watched my 26-year-old wife leave me. The divorce was a nightmare. Because I'd signed the I-864 Affidavit of Support for her visa, I was legally responsible for her. My lawyer told me that even though we were divorcing, I had to ensure she didn't become a public charge. I ended up having to pay her spousal maintenance of $1,800 a month for 2 years while she finished school. Then there was the property settlement. She was entitled to a portion of the house's appreciation during our marriage. Between legal fees for both sides, the settlement, and the support, the divorce alone cost me nearly $80,000. When I tally it all up, the money sent to Mexico, the wedding, the visas, the divorce, the spousal support, it's over $156,000. I'm 64 now. I'm $156,000 poorer. My 401k took a massive hit. My kids were right, and that's the hardest pill to swallow. I recently saw a photo of Sofia and Alejandro on Facebook. They're at a beach in Cancun. They look like they belong together. They look natural. I don't hate Sofia, I really don't. She was a 26-year-old girl who saw an opportunity to save her family from poverty, and she took it. She tried to be a wife, but you can't force a 26-year-old to want the life of a 60-year-old. You can't buy the shared experience of a generation. If you're watching this because you're talking to a beautiful young woman in Mexico, I'm not going to tell you not to go. But I am going to tell you to look in the mirror and be brutally honest. Are you in love with her, or are you in love with the way she makes you feel like you aren't aging? Are you prepared for the fact that her family's problems will become your financial obligations? And are you ready for the day she realizes that financial security isn't the same thing as happiness? I learned the hard way that loneliness makes smart men do very dumb things. I learned that you can buy a wedding, you can buy a visa, and you can buy a beautiful house, but you can't buy a future with someone who is living in a different century than you. I'm starting over now. It's quiet in this house again, but this time the silence doesn't bother me as much. It's better to be alone and have your dignity than to be married and realize you're just a bank account with a heartbeat. If this story made you think twice, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real talk about international dating and the realities of retirement. Leave a comment below. Have you ever dealt with a massive age gap? How did it end for you? Thanks for watching. Be careful out there.